Hello and welcome to the Romance Track here at Continual. I'm your host, Gail Z Martin, and tonight we are talking about fairy tale and fable romance. But before we launch into that, let's let our wonderful panelists introduce themselves, starting with Kim.
Hi, I'm Kim Fielding, and I write I write in all the genres. So I write gay romance, fantasy, science fiction, horror, whatever kind of strikes my fancy.
Okay, Miski.
Hi, I'm Miski Harris. Like Kim, I'm kind of all over the place. But my overall genre is gay romantic fiction. I do write Closed Door and Fade to Black. I feel the readers clutching their pearls, but yes, that's what I do. And I've dabbled in everything else, shifter, fantasy, fairy tale retelling. And as a matter of fact, right now I'm doing my first mythology book.
Very good. Alma.
Hi, I'm Alma Alexander, and my basic purview really isn't romance at all. I'm more of a fantasy slash science fiction slash that kind of person, writer. Straight romance I haven't really done, although there are romantic angles to a lot of my stuff, a lot of my books. And like Miski, I'm a fade to black kind of person when I have to be. It just feels easier that way to not to kind of crowd people. Three's the crowd behind a bedroom door.
Okay.
Anyway,
And I'm Gail Z
so.
Martin, and Morgan Brice. As Gail, I write epic and urban fantasy. As Morgan, I write urban fantasy, male paranormal romance. I have a mixture. The Gail and Larry books generally are the fade to black kind of thing, and the Morgan Brice are not. And I've done a lot of mythology, and everything has a supernatural angle. So yeah, the fairy tale and fable piece comes up more often than you'd think. Well, let's start with what fairy tales entranced you at a young age, and how have they influenced your writing? And Kim, while you start us off with that, I'm going to go get a bribe for my dog.
So I'm trying to think. I loved all fairy tales as a kid. I mean, they were just so much a part of what I read, and I liked the adaptations. I'd have to say probably one of my favorites was I'm going to say Snow White. I think that one's been one of my favorites, partly because it was one of my daughter's favorites. So when I had kids, my older daughter, when she was 2, she would watch the Disney one like over and over and over, and she had her little Snow White shoes. And I appreciated watching it with her, but also I think what I really liked about it was the witch. I have a thing about villains, and I really enjoyed the villain in that one. So I'd have to say that one was one of my favorites. Yeah.
So as a child, I read everything that had words. I don't know that I had a favorite fairy tale, but I do know that I was very disappointed when I learned that the Brothers Grimm were really dark. Because the Grimm's fairy tales that I grew up with all had, these lessons to be learned, but very pleasant, happy ever afters.
I'm going to be the cynic in the room. When I was a little girl, I always asked, whose happy ending is it? I basically never trusted the idea that, this person and that person could get a happy ending, but what happened to that third person behind the scenes there, and why didn't they get involved? And I was kind of rather equalizing and fair about things. And I disliked the whole, we're just going to step outside here and have our own happy ending and let the rest of the world can go hang. I didn't like that. And having said that, my preferences in fairy tales tended to be the darker stuff. The original Little Mermaid resonates for me far more than what Disney ever did to the poor girl. There is no singing lobsters in my version of The Little Mermaid. It's a tragedy, and Anderson was good at those. The Little Mermaid, The Little Match Girl, this kind of thing. But it did teach me empathy, and it taught me how to read people and have sympathy with people and have an understanding of their lives and of other people's lives, and the way that other people are always having undercurrents of drama that you may or may not know anything about, which is what fairy tales started me off on, just learning about humanity.
I always loved, well, I loved any of the mythology and the fairy tales, and there's a whole series of rather scholarly retellings of the fairy tales. Each one is from a different country, and they all have different color covers. There's like the pink book and the gray book, and I got my hands on those, and I just loved seeing how the same story would get retold and revised depending on the country that was telling the story. And I just remember being fascinated with that. I unapologetically read for escapism. So if it doesn't have a happy ending, I'm not going to read it. At this point in my life, I was big into tragedy when I was younger. Been there, done that, got the scars. Now I am purely into escapism and happy endings. And that's what I deliver for my books, because I figure everybody else is kind of fed up with the dumpster fire and everybody's looking for a happy ending. But I agree that in their original form, the fairy tales were often very instructive to, like, don't go into the woods at night, don't be near the running water, or else, kids don't listen, that they'll fall in and
Who your grandmother really is.
Huh?
Is it know who your grandmother really is?
Yeah. But kids don't care about falling into the water and drowning, but if they get grabbed by a water spirit and pulled under the water, that's a little scarier maybe. So you can certainly see that undercurrent, no pun intended, in the stories. And of course, they've changed depending on who's telling them and the purpose for telling them. Which brings us to the idea of fairy tale romance. How do you use fairy tales in your romantic writing, or when you're constructing stories that have a romantic element? And what makes you go back to fairy tales for your inspiration? Kim?
Because I write primarily gay romance, you have to make some shifts in the fairy tales, because most of them had straight characters. But one thing that I've done in quite a few of my stories is told the story from somebody else's point of view. So it's actually not even a romance, it's more of a horror story. I have a version of Little Red Riding Hood told from the point of view of the huntsman. I have a Sleeping Beauty told from the point of view of one of the would-be rescuers who gets killed by the bramble, which kind of allows you to take some fresh approaches. So there's often romantic aspects there in the stories themselves, but a lot of them are so problematic through modern eyes that you have to switch things, but that can be something fun to play with too. In the book I have, that's the Sleeping Beauty, our hero and the other person he meets, it's called the Muffin Man, and so the Muffin Man there's sentient sourdough involved. When they reach the princess, they've heard that you're supposed to kiss her in order to wake her up, but they both think that's kind of icky. There's some consent issues here, and neither of them really wants to kiss her anyway. So they come up with an alternate plan. So I think taking those, it feels familiar to us because we've heard these stories, and so our brain kind of settles into these nice kind of familiar things, like, okay, this is something I know, and then we can take that structure and play with it in a lot of really creative ways that are a lot of fun.
I think it's funny that you said that the fairies were often, were straight, because my reading on fairy tales is that the fairies were anything but straight.
Well, maybe the fairies weren't straight, but
very open-minded.
Yeah, and what's interesting is some of the authors, Hans Christian Andersen certainly had romantic feelings towards men. You know, there's a whole debate about what his sexuality may have been, but he certainly had romantic feelings towards men. That wouldn't have been something he probably felt comfortable expressing
Right.
outright in a story, but you know, I think it affected the stories. And this isn't a it's not a fairy tale, although I guess it's based on fairy tales, but Dracula too. I mean, Bram Stoker was almost certainly gay, or at least had feelings towards men. And if you know, you don't have to dig very deep into Dracula to see that subtext. And so although even if the characters themselves are straight, oftentimes there's a subtext there. Yeah.
Mhm. Okay. Miski.
Interestingly enough, a couple of years ago, I met a woman named Andy Lauren Kova. And every year she puts out an anthology, literally rewriting fairy tales. So the year I participated, I picked, of all the Grimm fairy tales in the world, I picked the juniper tree. I made my title Juniper's Tree. I turned Juniper into a character. Um, and everybody was dragon shifters except his mother, who was a magical being that I did not define. The tree itself was magic. And of course the villain died, because that's just me. I gotta kill something or blow something up. I'm not really particular which. But I found that I really enjoyed writing that story. And I've been recently sort of going through the list of fairy tales in my head, because I think I have another one in me.
Okay. Alma.
I kind of got tossed a challenge a couple of years back because somebody came across something on Facebook, as you do, and kind of threw it at me and said, do something with it. And what came out was a sort of hashtag witch lesbian romance rom-com kind of thing. And the storyline that I took was like, what would actually happen if two separate witches were both promised a firstborn by each parent at the same time, and they both turned up to claim their firstborn child in payment for their services at the same time. And in this particular instance, I had a country witch and a city witch, who had very little in common with each other, who both turned up to get their baby. And of course, things got a little bit heated. So they called in Baba Yaga, who is the sort of a proctor of the witch kind of thing, as a referee. And she essentially told them, you guys screwed up, you guys deal with it, you got shared custody. And I mean shared custody. The child has to live 6 months with one, 6 months with the other, and you have to deal with this. And of course they kind of went and fell in love with each other. But I had a lot of fun with that thing, because I had a lot of fun with the city mouse versus country mouse kind of trope type of thing. And the country witch was horrified by the city witch's lifestyle, and the city witch was kind of packing to go to live with the country witch for her kind of 6 months there, and was kind of going, what do you mean I can't wear those shoes out here, kind of thing. So that was fun. And I've done a lot of retellings of straight retellings of fairy tales in my life. I have an entire collection called Fractured Fairy Tales, which consists of fairy tales that you will recognize, a fairy tales that I purely invented, and stories that have a fairy tale aspect to them, which are not necessarily a fairy tale-ish kind of thing, but they just have that kind of feel to it. If you walk into the portal of the story, it feels like a fairy tale. It doesn't necessarily have all the exact tropes of one, but it's a collection of all those things. So
Okay.
that was quite an interesting kind of path to go down.
Okay. I think the most recent one that I've done that had a fairy tale inspiration was Gruff. I originally wrote it for the Fables Retold collection, which was a limited time collection. We had to write a male romance based on a traditional fairy tale. And so mine was the Three Billy Goats Gruff with goat shifters. So we had goat shifters in love, one of whom was a fainting goat, and that led to some really interesting things. But it was just a lot of fun to take that idea of, well, what if they're shifters? Well, what if part of the time they're goats, but they're really, have the human sentience? And what if this one guy inadvertently just faints now and then? Which threw a few curveballs for the romance, but it was fun. And I've enjoyed reading other stories that take those kind of odd turns with the fable you think you know, and give you something that's really fresh and delightful. And that's a lot of fun to deliver. So what's your favorite fairy tale and why? Kim?
I think probably my favorite fairy tale actually is the Gollum story. And I wrote actually I've written two very different versions of it myself. And Isaac Bashevis' Singer's version, is the most classic, but it's a story that's been around for a long time. And I the- I like the themes of it. So those of you who aren't familiar with the Gollum story, it comes to us from like 16th century, 17th century Eastern Europe, and it's a Jewish story where the Jewish community is threatened, as was often the case, and the rabbi finds a way to create this golem, this creature out of clay to protect the community, and he animates it by inscribing a Hebrew word on it, and then when it's done protecting everybody, he can erase the Hebrew word and it'll fall back to dust. And some of the I like some of the themes there. I really enjoy, and it makes me think about things like what is humanity, what is heroism, those kinds of things. So that's and it's Frankenstein in a way was kind of a more modern take on it. So, and it's always been one of my kind of favorites anyway. So yeah, Golem.
Okay, Miski.
My off the top of my head answer is I don't know, because I like so many of them. But I guess my favorite would probably be Sleeping Beauty, because I came to love the movie Maleficent, where they told the witch's story. And all of a sudden I was like, oh, the poor witch, So I guess that would be it. I like any fairy tale, and most of them do, that sort of shows you the rewards of greed. You burn in the fire, you melt in water, get thrown in the oven. So I guess that's where I stand. I've sort of got a mishmash. I'm more it's more the moral that's the favorite for me than the actual story.
Okay, Alma.
Well, I already mentioned The Little Mermaid, and I mean the original one, not the Disney one. But I also grew up on a slightly different set of fairy tales, if you like, because part of my Eastern European heritage meant Russian fairy tales. And what I grew up on was tales of Vasilisa Prekrasna, which is the sorceress princess who could do all kinds of interesting things. One of my favorite stories was that in Russian fairy tales, let me put it this way, there are always three princes, and the youngest one is always called Ivan, and he's always the one that gets everything done. His older brothers are idiots, and this is a given. In every Russian fairy tale, you're going to have three princes, two of whom are nuts, and one of whom is actually underestimated by everybody, but who eventually gets everything right. And in this particular story, the father said to his oldest son, shoot an arrow where it lands, that the girl he will marry. So he shoots an arrow, gets an aristocratic wife, and that's all fine. The second son does the same. He gets a merchant's daughter. That's all fine. The third son, poor Ivan, shoots his arrow. It lands in the middle of the marsh, and he picks up by a frog. So his father implacably says, you must now marry the frog. So the poor guy marries his frog and is very despondent about it. Of course, it's an enchanted frog. You get the story here. The other wives, the ordinary wives, are now thrown into a position where they have to keep up with the Joneses, as it were, because they have to keep up with this massively magical creature who would, you know, they could see her in a feast. She would pour chicken bones in one sleeve and some chicken broth in the other. And while she's dancing, she's going to throw that one sleeve and the chicken broth turn into a lake, and the other sleeve and the chicken bones turn into a swan. And they said, okay, well, we can do the same thing. And when they tried, they splashed chicken broth on everyone and throw bones in the king's face, kind of thing. But you know, that kind of comeuppance, almost in a way, is wonderful when you're reading these fairy stories, and they're not that familiar to a lot of people out there. And I think that they probably should have a lot more readership, because they're just so much fun. You always get these weird magical objects like a comb, which you then have to remember to throw behind you, and it becomes a forest and things like that. It's just wonderful.
Yeah, one of the things that I always loved about reading fairy tales from all over the world was how much they reflected the culture and the climate and the, you know, everything about the country that they came from, and how different that made the story. You know, I've had a lot of favorites over the years, but I've got to admit that my current favorite is the Disney version of the Rumpelstiltskin. I'm sorry, the Rapunzel tale, which is Tangled, just because it's so darn much fun. And the music is good, especially the dancing at the bar where everybody talks about living their dream. And you know, the original fairy tale never grabbed me that hard, but I really like what they've done with it. And of course, Disney's a modern myth maker. They take the myths and they remake them for a current generation, and 100 years from now, somebody else will do the same thing, unless their IP doesn't ever let go, and then it'll still be Disney doing it. But, you know, we'll have to wait and see. So that's my current favorite, although there have been many, many over the years. If there is a fairy tale that you haven't done as a romance or as a story, but you'd like to, what is it? Kim?
I don't know if I have one in mind, but I'm really interested in exploring some of the lesser known ones, whether they're from Grimm or from other cultures that a lot of people are less familiar with. I wrote one story called The Grave Mound, and it's it's a science fiction story, but it's based on a Grimm story that I'd actually never heard of until I started digging around. And there is so much. I mean, there's like a dozen that we've seen, the Disney ones, and that we've seen and heard so many times, but there's so many out there that we haven't. So I don't know, but I'd really like to spend some more time digging around some of those ones that we're less familiar with.
Okay, Miski.
I'm actually getting ready to do that. I joined an anthology and the team chose mythology. So I'm digging into my own culture, which is Seminole Indian history. And in that history, the stronger, more favored clan is the panther. So my panther's going to be a shifter. And the creators have an owl. Owls are usually dark creatures, like think witches. But for some reason, this owl is very omegish. So they're gonna send the owl to balance out the panther, who has decided to live amongst us ordinary humans. I haven't figured out how that's gonna turn out, but the town doesn't know he's there.
Okay, Alma.
I kind of like to tackle things like Swan Lake, but with swans being the kind of swans that are real swans. The swans are cranky. Swans are brutes. Swans that they don't take, you know, they don't suffer fools gladly. And I would really kind of like to get stuck into a real Swan Lake situation where one of them gets wronged and the rest of the swans kind of go, they did what? And then you get a bunch of very angry swan guys turning up in someone's front yard with their sleeves rolled up around their elbows going, right, now you pay. It's going to be an interesting, less flowery, less graceful kind of swan story, but I'd love to give it a bat.
And people underestimate how big swans are. Swans are huge.
Huge, yes.
I mean, geese are big and they have tempers, but swans are gigantic.
And they
So-
can hurt you.
Yes,
One can hurt
Yes.
you.
When I
Being-
lived on Long Island, we had a small, they called it a lake, but to me it was more of a pond. And every year the swans would return. That was my first encounter, in touching distance with a swan. Trust, I did not touch that thing because it sat on the water looking at me like, yeah, bring it. Come on.
Yes, so being accosted by a gang of swans would be really terrifying. So I can't wait to read that, Alma. Go for it. As Alma pointed out early on, many classic fairy tales in their original or near original telling definitely aren't romances, or certainly don't have the happy ending we look for in a romance. How did fairy tales and romance get stirred up together that we often think of them as, well, there's the phrase, a fairy tale romance.
A lot of
or
that's
a fairy
Disney.
tale wedding.
A lot of that's Disney. Disney kind of sublimated the fairy tale into these pretty princesses that dance around in the woods and get their prince coming to them, and all the animals are helping, and it's all pretty and it's all fun and it's all great, and everybody gets their happily ever after, and the end. And there's an entire generation or more than one generation of kids to whom that is the fairy tale.
I'm still waiting for the forest animals to come wash my dishes. I mean, I'm just saying.
Yeah,
I-
but a lot of us who grew up slightly before the entire Disney thing kind of took over the fairy tale genre do remember the darker edges of the fairy tales, which
Yes.
existed before Disney turned up and remade them in their own image.
Yeah, and it's always interesting when your kids decide to go looking for those classics and you go, just realize it's not going to be what you think it is.
Yeah.
Right? I think that somewhere, especially since the United States is a capitalist country, I think that somebody decided that making those stories palatable for children would bring in revenue, because a lot of fairy tales were stories that were told to scare children into being good. If you don't behave, Peter Pan is going to come and get you and take you to the island of the lost boys, and you'll never be seen again. And what's that thing, the Krampus at Christmas time? So but when I was growing up, we didn't have much time for fairy tales. I was too busy trying to survive a country that hated me for a lot of reasons. So
You were living a fairy tale of your own, not a good one.
I was living a fairy tale on my own. I mean, nobody wanted poor little me. I was what my grandmother's people called a coyote, because I was mixed race. So in my own personal fairy tale, I would become one thing or the other and be able to, live happily. I didn't care which group. I just wanted somebody to claim me.
Mm-hmm.
But I think one of the reasons why fairy tales continue to speak to us, whether they're Disney or not, is because they do pull on these sort of universal themes like belonging. You know, if you think about what are these stories about, they're about things we can all sort of relate to. And it might be romance, it might be parenting, it might be poverty, it might be finding your place in the world, or, you know, finding your tribe, you know. And I think, you know, regardless of whether romance or not is involved, those are and regardless of the culture, really, they're things we can all kind of, they resonate with us. And even, you know, some of these stories are hundreds of years old, and nobody's, you know, nobody's living in huts in the woods or whatever anymore, but we can still kind of understand them because those are still things
You
we
don't have to
struggle
live,
with in our own ways.
you don't have to live in a hut in the wood for a fairy tale thing to be real. My grandmother lived a fairy tale life. My grandmother was the daughter of an heiress whom her father married for the money, kind of thing. She was very, very rich, very pretty, and very fragile. And she gave birth to my grandmother and promptly died. My grandfather was left alone with a young baby and remarried very quickly to a stepmother from hell. The stepmother from hell promptly produced a son, and that sealed my grandmother's fate. And she was literally Cinderella. She was kind of expected to do all the grudge work and which I don't think she literally slept in the cinders in the kitchen, but damn near close to it. She had a room by herself outside the main house, out where the animals were. And when she was 18 years old, she ran away to marry my grandfather, who was, and don't get me the wrong way, I love him. I think he's the most wonderful human being alive, but he was a product of his time, and he was a very patriarchal creature. And if he went like this, he expected his women to jump. And she went from the frying pan into that fire, and she basically lived her entire life. That was the happy ending, huh? That was the happy ending of the fairy tale. She kind of went into a relationship from someone to protect her from the horrible life that she was living, but she had to deal with the realities of the fact that she was still somebody's property in one sense.
Mm-hmm. Well, and I think that the fish out of water thing is very much a part of the fairy tales, at least in a lot of the modern retellings and many of the other ones. It's the stepchild, it's the orphan, it's the person, the changeling, the foundling, the one who doesn't belong, who ends up finding some element of justice in a world that we all know isn't just. And so I think that's part of the allure of the fairy tale, is that in the real world, things usually don't turn out for the best, or often don't, but in a fairy tale, the fish out of water gets the prince. Cinderella gets to be queen. I always thought she should have gone much harder on her stepsisters. The one who was rejected ends up getting everything. And that's part of the fantasy, I think, whether or not the fairy tale is retold to include romance in that. That's part of the fantasy. And I think we buy into it because we know the world often doesn't work like that. But give me a story where it does. And let me have an hour or two where I can be in a world where good things happen to good people and bad guys get what's coming to them.
It's not so much justice. And I think this very much kind of lines up with what you said about fairies, because fairies are not, they're not moral in the sense that we're moral. They're kind of amoral. They do things because things are done that way, not because they're right or proper, or somebody expects them to do that way. And in fairy tales, people and other creatures don't so much often get justice, but they get what they deserve.
That's true, and that's a very important distinction. Miski, any thoughts on that?
In my little world, you're right. They get what they deserve. I like making the odd man out suddenly become the standard. sort of like, don't step on me because my barbs will come out and cut your feet. Personally, I never thought of fairies as women. I always thought of them as sort of having no sexual identity at all. And I think that's just the product of the time I grew up, because women had barely had rights. You know, when I was growing up, they were just starting to be allowed to smoke in public. So I think I think that that's why I'm so curious about fairy tales now, because I just really didn't have them growing up.
Okay.
I,
Kim? Oh, I'm
I read
sorry.
strange books.
How about you, Kim?
I'm sorry, what was the question?
Oh, we were talking about fairy tales and getting what people deserve and how the odd man out or the stepchild ends up the princess.
Yeah, I mean, I agree with you that, you know, there is often a deep sense of justice in these, and it, you know, it may not be happy endings. It's certainly in a lot of them there weren't happy endings, but you know, the things turned out the way they should. You know, the people got their just desserts, and I think that's a satisfying thing to read, because it so rarely happens in real life. And you know, again, the fact that people have returned to these stories for centuries says that they're fulfilling something, some sort of kind of need we have. You know, there's a reason we keep retelling these stories, and I think the sense of, you know, people will get what they deserve is something we all wish could be true.
Mhm.
And it can be, you know, it can be used in a negative sense, as a, you know, as a warning that, you know, behave yourself or else. But it can also be used in a sense of, eventually, you know, your stepmother may be cruel, but eventually you'll get what you should have. And I think that does fulfill a need in us.
I think it's also interesting that the fairies often serve as kind of a trickster character because they are different from us. Their morality is different, their sense of justice is different. To a great deal, they really don't give a darn because they aren't of our world and they are more powerful. And
We
so
also
they're,
live on a different timeline. I mean, basically, if you
yeah,
take a look at a lot of the fairy stories from like Tamlin and the fairy folk, they kidnap someone from our world and then he goes back to our world a day later, and it's 100 years has passed.
right.
So the fairies, they don't really have the same sort of sense of time is passing. We have to do something now, because otherwise it's going to be too late. It's not going to be too late for them because they still have 150 years left to go, kind of thing.
Right. And they have powers that we don't. And so when they intersect with the mortal world, it's almost because they feel like meddling or they feel like causing tricks or they feel like just causing trouble. And you know, they're all of the things about how not to get ensnared by them because they are tricky. And I think that adds a lot to the fairy tales, is that sense of otherness and that sense of not, we may encounter them in our world, but they're not really of our world. And be careful because the rules can be different. And
Yeah,
like
there
Alma
is
said, you
there,
might end up 100 years later.
there's a
Oh,
sense
you know,
in there.
they have a unique way of saying, you know, all right, this happened, build a bridge and get over it. That they have that kind of attitude. It's like, all right, let's just move on and do this.
Mhm.
I just wanted to say that when it comes to fairies, to the fae, to that world, the whole interaction between us and them also hinges on something very like debt, or, you know, in other words, don't eat anything that the fairies give you because otherwise you'll owe them.
Right.
Yeah.
Moral obligation. Yeah. Yeah.
And it's
There's
an
always that.
obligation that you may or may not be ready for or willing to give, but they live according to different rules. And if you break their rules, even if you don't know that you're breaking their rules, you'd better know what rules that you shouldn't be breaking, because if you do, they don't care. Ignorance is no excuse for the breaking of the laws. Basically, if you do the wrong thing, you've done the wrong thing, and no one's, there's no gentle person out there going, there, you didn't know, we'll let you off the hook that time.
But I think it's important that there are rules, and in the stories, if you're clever enough, you can succeed even with these very powerful and sort of morally amoral beings, as long as you follow the rules. And I think again that's it's probably my background in psychology, but it's a message people like to hear, that I can't control the world. There's all these powerful things I don't have any control over, and bad things happen. But if I can just be clever enough and figure out the rules, I can still win. And so in a lot of those stories, the ordinary human does win because they're smart enough to kind of figure out.
Isn't that where Shakespeare sort of came in? I was, as you were speaking about the moral code, I was thinking of The Merchant of Venice. They got out of giving the pound of flesh because the contract said nothing about blood. So you can have your pound of flesh, but not one drop of blood, which meant they didn't get that pound of flesh. So there is a way around fables, but you have to be very literal in dealing with them.
Well, folks, we have blown through our time. I think we could keep talking about this all night, and this has been a lot of fun, but we have blown through our time. So I want to give everyone a chance to say where we can find you online. And if you have a new, recent, or upcoming book, please tell us about it. Kim?
So I can be found everywhere online as K Fielding Writes. So on Facebook, X, Blue Sky, and my website is kfieldingwrites.com. And I actually have a brand new book out that is based on Hansel and Gretel, and it's breadcrumbs. And I've taken Hansel and Gretel and put it in a contemporary setting and made it really angsty. So
sounds fun. Miski?
Well, I can be found on all the social media offenders. I have a website, miskiharris.com. I'm going to way too many signings. So if you're going to a signing, you'll probably see me there. I'm really excited because my next signing is actually in the UK. I'm going to Blackpool. My latest book out is was a Christmas story called Gingerbread that I've decided to spread out. So as a part of an anthology we wrote for H.M. Wolf to help her out, I wrote a story called Hearts and Stones, and I'm going to meld those two stories together with And They Lived, without the happily ever after, but just And They Lived, which is kind of apropos to this conversation.
Absolutely. Alma?
I like that. I want to read that. I'm on my website, which is almaalexander.org, not .com, .org. Somebody stole .com, and the last I looked, it was dog chow in Chinese, but don't ask me. So just be careful. It's the .org that will take you to my website, almaalexander.org. I'm at the usual suspect, the Facebook, Blue Sky. I have a Patreon out there in case somebody wants to know. I have a general kind of presence out in the social media, except for the fact that X or X Twitter doesn't seem to like me anymore. I can't seem to log in anymore, so I don't think you're going to find me there anymore.
Okay.
Before we go, you said the latest thing. My latest kind of thing that came out last year was a reissue of my World Weaver series, which is Gift of the Unmage, Spell Spam, Cyber Mage, and Dawn of Magic, which is a kind of a sort of very American version of that great classic called Harry Potter, except that it deals with a girl instead of a boy, and it's a very American mythological route rather than British.
Okay. And I'm pretty easy to find at gailzmartin.com, morganbrice.com. I'm on all the socials, or at least most of the major ones, under one or both of those names. So if you spell them right, you'll find me. The most recent Morgan Brice book is Signs and Wonders in the Witchbane series, and there'll be a new one coming out in Treasure Trail series, Last Resort, very soon. And the most recent Gail book is Reckoning, which is the third book in the Darkhurst series. So thank you so much for being such wonderful panelists. And thanks to all of you for watching and listening. There will be more romance panels coming up on Continual, so we'll see you online.